It is interesting that the French Revolution is considered by many historians to have begun on the 14th of July, 1789, the same day that a furious mob of revolutionaries stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a notorious medieval fortress, armory, and political prison in which many respects symbolized the tyrannical abuse of power carried out by the French monarchy. Incidentally, this day of more than mild civil disobedience is a French national holiday, known as Bastille Day. What is interesting in this event is not so much the event itself, but the way in which it was interpreted at the time. In hindsight, the storming of the Bastille clearly marked the beginning of the French Revolution. At the time, however, the meaning behind the siege was quite undecided. Many parties regarded the storming of the Bastille as relatively unimportant in the grand scheme of things. It was not viewed by the monarchy as a sign of their impending dissolution. Even Thomas Jefferson, who was coincidentally stationed in Paris in the summer of 1789, and who was a keen observer of French political and cultural events, did not view the storming of the Bastille as the spark which would ignite full-blown revolution. Jefferson was one of the greatest political and philosophical thinkers of all time, and his contemporaries would have considered him a leading authority on current political and cultural events, even in Paris. In a letter written just 5 days after the storming of the Bastille, written to John Jay, Jefferson said, "Tranquility is now restored to the capital. The shops are again opened, the people resuming their labors, and, if the want of bread does not disturb our peace, we may hope a continuance of it." It was only until 3 months later did the situation become clear to all. On the morning of October the 5th, dozens of women were searching the city for food. At an outdoor marketplace in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine neighborhood in Paris, people finally decided that enough was enough. Store shelves were practically empty, and bread in particular, which was the staple of the French diet, was in critically short supply. Subsequently, the universal law of supply and demand, invisibly working everywhere and at all times, had caused whatever bread that was available to be sold at extremely high prices. Now, this was nothing new for the French peasants, as the government had consistently mismanaged the economy so poorly that food supplies had been falling for several years. Abnormally high prices all the way back to the 1770s had been the subject of multiple riots and protests. Nonetheless, the discontentment felt by those women on the morning of October 5th proved to be a tipping point. When a single young woman standing in the corner of the marketplace began beating a drum, this signaled that it was time for another protest. Marching through the streets of Paris, more and more supporters joined in, quickly bringing the total number of protesters up to 10,000 people. The hungry mob first stopped at the Paris City Hall, located at the Hôtel de Ville. Without having to be asked twice, the officials opened the grain reserves to feed the hungry protesters. The protesters also seized arms in the form of rifles and ammunition. This was a start, but the now armed mob was still far from appeased. At this point, they didn't just want bread, they wanted revolution. From City Hall, they marched all the way to the Royal Palace of Versailles, a trip which took a total of 6 hours. Once they arrived, King Louis XVI met personally with some of the protest leaders. He made several concessions and promised to give them more food and to even accept a new Bill of Rights for the French people. Even though their demands were mostly met, the crowd still wasn't satisfied. The next morning, beginning around 6 a.m., the disgruntled protesters decided to enter the palace. They faced virtually no resistance from the royal guards, and all in all, 1 protester and 1 guard were killed. People were easily able to access the inside of the palace, free to wander through the ornate halls and enjoy the magnificent artwork covering the walls and ceilings. Undoubtedly, their utter disbelief and underlying disgust at the sheer luxuriousness of the palace would have kept them occupied for some time. But after several hours, the protest's leadership had located the king and demanded that he accompany them back to Paris. He agreed. The march took roughly 9 hours, and it felt more like a parade than a political demonstration. The crowd, which had by now grown to about 60,000 people, was overjoyed and ecstatic at the realization that the king was at their mercy and that they, the common people, were the ones in control. The end of this march concluded in the king's permanent residence being changed from Versailles to Paris, and in his commitment to change the absolute monarchy to that of a constitutional monarchy. From that point on, the king was no longer the king of France, but the king of the French, though not for long.